Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the final lecture of the quarter, actually. And originally, when I was planning this class, of course, it doesn't need to deal with this material so much, but I thought it would be nice as a kind of hors d'oeuvre tray to end the quarter by looking at some art of South or Southeast Asia, just to give you an idea of some of the other traditions that are out there, should you be lucky enough to take an entire quarter on this really complicated material, frankly, because, of course, a lot of the religious traditions of what we've been covering so far extend to Judaic or Christian beliefs, or even when we're talking about Muslim beliefs, they are things that even if we're not Christians or Muslims or Jews, we live in a society that is very, very, what do I want to say, kind of imbricated by all of these ideas. They are implicit in so much that we do that when I, as an art historian, start talking about these ideas, I think they're pretty familiar to us. And then when you move to Asia, most of us don't know a ton about its history or about some of its major religions. And honestly, these topics are best taught in a much longer course. But with that being said, I thought I'd give you a very short lecture on some of the early forms of primarily Buddhist art in the area that is contemporary India or parts of Tibet, as well as parts that are kind of, moving over into the area that is today contemporary China as well. So if you look at the map here that I have on the screen, most of what we're looking at is in this area from India to Burma or Myanmar. And of course, these things are encroached upon. And should you take another course on China, you'll see a lot of adoption of the same ideas between these different cultures. And they, Buddhism and Hinduism, of course, go back into the prehistoric times in these areas around the world. But, I'm not going to try to cover everything that's in your text on this topic. There are some wonderful, wonderful monuments from Thailand in particular associated with Hinduism that are in your text that I don't want to overwhelm you at this point in the quarter. And frankly, it's not my area of expertise either. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that hopefully will spark your interest in this area of the world and give you some kind of insight into their artistic forms as well. So, like your text, I'm going to start off with this monument and tell you a little bit about Buddhism to get going. This is the lion capital from Sarnath, created roughly in the 3rd century BCE, around the time of the reign of Ashokan. Ashokan was a major leader in what is contemporary India, who originally, in a way, if you're looking for a kind of parallel, he's a little bit like Constantine the Great. He is certainly interested in Buddhist ideas that have been around since the 6th century BCE. But he is an expansive leader who's trying to extend his kingdom. And then, as you'll read in your text, kind of partway through this, with all the catastrophes that befall him, he very strongly kind of begins to associate his own rule with Buddhist philosophies, which is a little bit of an uneasy connection between the two religions, since Buddhism doesn't have any aspirations for world dominion by any stretch of the imagination, I suppose. But that's the way, of course, that the state oftentimes adopts and extends religion as a form of, or a mechanism of control of its people. This is a capital for a larger column. I'll show you one of these pillars or columns later on that Ashokan put up all over his kingdom. These columns, as you will have read in your textbook, are not so dissimilar than the old stelae that we saw around the world, including the famous stele of Naram Sin that, or frankly, the Oath of Hammurabi, that would be placed in various parts of the kingdom so as to be associated with the king's rule and his philosophy of governing. This would have been at the top of one of those columns. So maybe even before going into this, it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about Buddhism, which we'll see coming up. I think most people have a general idea about Buddhism. and its philosophy. But let's just kind of get the religious story behind all of this. Buddhism, by the way, has a number of different uh, sects, so to speak, in the same way that Christianity, if you think of it, has Catholicism and various forms of Protestantism. Buddhism has, especially early on, three major forms to it. Two that are very closely related are Theravada Buddhism and Nikaya Buddhism. These are forms of Buddhism that really push the idea of Buddhism being something that is about kind of self-determination or self-fulfillment, that are oftentimes very closely associated with the religion of Buddhism and with the state of Buddhism. They are primarily about people trying to self-perfect through following the teachings of Buddhism or exercising control when a leader takes over Buddhism over the people. Whereas the third form, and one of the most dominant forms that really gains ascendance, beyond the mechanism of state control, is Mahayana Buddhism, which fosters the idea of compassion, fosters the idea that the Buddhist practice is about bringing people into Buddhism so that they can have a better life, and is much less kind of strict, let's say, in its teachings or in its expectations of people, although it follows the same kind of cardinal rules. Buddhism comes out of this famous figure whose name was Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama was a prince, rather, of a major ruler who tried to protect his son from pain and suffering by coddling him and surrounding him with beauty. But Siddhartha saw this suffering in the world around him and felt it in himself as well. And at a fairly young age, Siddhartha became an ascetic. The term ascetic is meant to refer to someone who devotes himself entirely to a spiritual practice and basically divorces himself from material wants or desires. In this case, Siddhartha Gautama basically spent 6 or so years, according to legend, meditating and trying to uncover what would push humanity beyond what he saw was its fundamental condition, which was suffering. Now, what he means by suffering is a tricky one. On the one hand, what he means is that he's here. He is this ruling elite, and he's surrounded by people in poverty who don't have enough to live on, and of course are worried about where their next meal is going to come from. That's a form of suffering, but it's also the universal idea of suffering in that he saw suffering as something that always went along with any kind of joy. If we have extreme joy in our lives, that joy can only be understood in reference to forms of suffering or forms of lack. And one of the big kinds of forms of suffering is having to confront death, which is a universal condition. We're all going to die, of course. And so he set his mind to thinking about these things. And over the course of the 6 years or so that he spent meditating, according to legend, Siddhartha Gautama gained enlightenment, which the Buddhists called nirvana, a state beyond human suffering, beyond desires in the world, which, of course, are the counterpoint to suffering, and became Shakyamuni Buddha, or the Buddha, the enlightened one. Underneath Buddhism, there are usually two different, very related goals. One is called Chakravartin, or becoming the world conqueror or ruler. This is something that is adopted, for instance, by Ashokan, who believes that his own moral goodness under Buddhism is something that then needs to be extended to the rest of the world, thus justifying his rule. Again, this is not so dissimilar than every world religion that I know of that has been adopted by the state, in which, of course, there is a spiritual component to the religion, but there's also this belief that that it needs to be extended to all people, such as the proselytizing of Christians or the colonizing of various countries, so to extend religion. And the other side of Buddhism, or just kind of Buddhism in general, is just to attain the status of enlightenment or to become the fully enlightened figure of the Buddha. Some of the terms, a couple of which I've already covered here: nirvana, which means enlightenment. Again, enlightenment doesn't, unlike the other religions that we've encountered so far, doesn't necessarily mean coming into contact with God. Buddhism doesn't really have a central God. It has the Buddha, who is, in some sense, an exemplar of the state of being beyond suffering and beyond joy. Nirvana means, again, a kind of being aware of all things and finding the middle road between them in a state of constant kind of stoicism or middle ground. Dharma is a big term in Buddhism. Dharma is usually referred to as the law. The law is really the moral teachings of Buddha, the way to attain enlightenment. And under Buddhism, you'll oftentimes hear the term Dharma chakra, or wheel of law. And you see that wheel right here in the center of this piece. The wheel, and by the way, the wheel would have also been on the top of this column as well. The big wheel of the law refers to the idea of both the Chakravartin as well as the Buddha, in the sense that the teachings of Buddha actually starts the wheel of the law rolling, so to speak. He starts us to understand the way that the universe works and to come into some kind of equilibrium with that. But it can also be used as this ruler did, Ashoka, to think about the way that Buddhist law or Buddhist moral teachings allow for the Chakravartin, the world leader, to extend these ideas to all of his conquests, for instance. In strict speaking, though, the wheel of the law under Buddhism is the way to attain enlightenment. The teachings, the various steps that you have to go through to attain this state of enlightenment here. For under Buddhist teachings, of course, to attain the state of nirvana, one follows the so-called Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Moral Truths are for instance, one, life is suffering. That if you're seeking joy in all things, you should be aware that suffering is a huge component of life, and in seeking joy, again, according to some teachings of Buddhism, what you end up doing is making your sorrows even more difficult in comparison. Becoming aware of the fact that life is a form of suffering was kind of the first premise under which Buddha went off to seek Dharma. Number two, ignorance and desire cause suffering. So not knowing the state of the universe, seeking your desires are things that will actually intensify your suffering. Number three, that suffering can be overcome. And number four, that the path for overcoming suffering is the so-called Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path, which is much more complicated than these words will give you, is a very disciplined practice in which someone tries to attain the right view, the right resolve, the right speech, the right action, the right livelihood, the right effort, the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. Now, with all that being said, if we look at the visible form of this capital, it fits in really nicely with Buddhist philosophy. At the top are four Asiatic lions, all back to back, all facing back to back, and all facing the cardinal directions, as if to say that this leader Ashoka's dominion extends over all 4 realms. Remember, this goes all the way back to the palette of Narmer and many other things that seek the cardinal directions that we've come in contact with this quarter. Lions are symbols of power, of course, the symbol of the leader, but notice how these lions' mouths are open. That may partially refer to the idea that the voice of Buddha was like the roar of a lion, or the lion's roar. And so it's like they're speaking the word of Buddha to all people to alleviate human suffering. But it's also very political, isn't it? It's a symbol of kingship. It's a symbol of power. It's a symbol of Ashokan as the Chakravartin. The Chakravartin, meaning the world leader here. Below that, and remember the wheel would also be on the top here, which has been lost. There's a wheel of the law here, the Dharma chakra, as it's so called. And in between these wheels, which are on all 4 cardinal directions, are various animals symbolizing power here. So you have a bull, an elephant, a horse, and another lion here, all symbols of power. And the entire thing rests upon a stylized lotus blossom. The lotus position in yoga and the lotus blossom in general is a symbol of enlightenment, the symbol of becoming, of flowering into the state of Dharma. Such capitals as those would have sat on top of these giant pillars. This is the pillar of Ashokan. King Ashoka, of course, ruled from 273 to around 232 BCE. He is the first of these great kings to have adopted Buddhism, probably under political expediency as well as his own belief system. He's part of the so-called Maurya period in India, which extended well beyond his reign until about 185 or so BCE. And, his reign exemplifies the spread of Buddhism under the state itself. So imagine that column sitting at the top as this lion does, of these columns that were set up all over his kingdom and would have been inscribed with both words from Buddhism as well as his own kind of political agenda. One of the things that's consistent, hopefully we're starting to see this in the traditions of the representation of women, or what women represent in the world, is exemplified by this so-called female figure with a fly whisk from India, again, from about 250 BCE. If you just kind of refer back in your mind to the earliest Venus figures, this is much the same. It's what's called a Yakshi figure. Yakshi are female personifications of the feminine principle in the universe, meaning both fertility and fecundity, reproduction, the power of the universe to produce, basically. That is the typical way that women or femininity are pictured, as symbols of the birth principle, of the reproductive principle. And here in this figure who's clearly human and looks a little bit like a queen, the Yakshi figures are the female complement of what's known as the Yaksha figure, a kind of rotund little male figure who exemplifies the natural kind of virile male principle in the universe. All the areas that would have been associated with fertility and fecundity and sex. And by the way, when you're in this part of the world, sexuality is not something that is circumscribed by Judeo-Christian beliefs, thinking it's bad. It goes all the way back to those early Venus figures in which it's good. We emphasize the very, very large breasts here, the area of the abdomen, the huge hips, and while it doesn't show the pubic region, it surely emphasizes it with the way that the folds of the robe, fall here as well. So in other words, this woman is or this figure, and there are thousands of these, and they adorn the temples everywhere, are symbols of the procreative forces of nature given human form, and frankly worshipped. The major form of Buddhist architecture, which you can find these stupa all over the Asian world, are known as stupa. And this is the great stupa at Sanchi, one of the earliest, biggest of these. This is from around 150 to 50 BCE. It's been recreated a number of different times, by which I simply mean it was built once as a just giant earth mound. That earth mound was then covered with baked brick. Those baked bricks were then covered with a stucco that was made out of crushed shells so as to create this beautiful, vibrant white surface, and a lot of that has since deteriorated from this. The stupa are they're based upon the principle of a mausoleum in a sense. The Great Stupa here at Sanchi, like most of them, is understood to have either held a Buddha figure, a Bodhisattva figure, or actually have had the ashes of Buddha interred in them. So that, like those religious structures that we've seen in Christian societies, the site is really important, and the fact that they hold remnants of some spiritual person is really important as well. In fact, many of the stupa are based upon the principle that a religious figure in Buddhism actually was buried here seated in the lotus pose somewhere in the interior of this, and the entire form represents this kind of new womb from which the spirituality of that figure emanates. And sometimes the symbolism goes so far as to say that this big earth mound form is the body of the Buddha. These umbrella forms at the top are the head of the Buddha, and his feet stick in the earth so as to generate the earth and kind of fill us all with the good of Buddha. I'm going to move forward here for a second to show you the structure of this whole thing, and to talk about these different terms that are associated with it. The dome form, which most of these, by the way, are not open in the interior. Later on, as you see off to the right, when these become Templar structures, they do actually have an open area on the interior with an image or a sculpture of Buddha in there to be worshipped. But most of these are closed forms. Down the middle is what's known as the axis mundi, or the center of the universe, kind of a centering agent or symbol of the idea of all things emanate from this one central axis. At the top are umbrellas. The umbrellas are symbolic. Sometimes they are believed to be the actual umbrellas that are used or parasols that are used to shade rulers. And other times they are understood to be symbols of what are called the three jewels of Buddhism. And those three jewels are, number one, the Buddha; number two, the law or Dharma, law of Buddha; and number three, the monastic order, or the monks, the Buddhist monks who continue the traditions of the Buddha. Around the outside are four gates known as toranas, and the four gates are aligned with the four cardinal directions, and usually these gates are very richly decorated, either with passages that talk about the speakings of Buddha or other passages of Dharma. Sometimes they're decorated simply with the life of Buddha, as you'll see in your textbook, and of course they come in threes more often than not to represent those three jewels of Buddhism. Around the interior at the bottom, you see this railing, very important in all religious structures to separate the everyday mundane world from the spiritual realm of the templo. In this, you have a fence or railing that goes around the entire exterior of this, and at the base of this, in between the stupa dome form itself and the railing, is an area to circumambulate, walk around this structure. That walking around, which also occurs up here on the second level, which is usually reserved for more important people, at least historically, the circumambulation is like putting into action the wheel of the law. Remember that wheel of the law that pushes the ideas of Buddhism, and so monks will walk around this, or believers will walk around this so as to start the wheel moving, so to speak. And by the way, that's not so dissimilar than the Roman practice of decursio, which we saw back there in the column of Trajan and other forms as well. If we were to look at one of these Taranas, this is in your textbook with a nice little key. It's a little bit hard to see here, I'm sure, for you, so refer to your textbook on this. These tend to tell of the life of Buddha. In various cases, if you look over here, there's like an empty horse and parasols here, and over here another empty horse as well. We believe that these are supposed to represent the Buddha. Now, at the time that this was created, there were still a bunch of rules from earlier religions about picturing gods, which is maybe why Buddha wasn't represented here, although under Buddhism itself, there are no rules about representing the Buddha. So this is kind of a holdover from earlier traditions. And it talks about his kind of pilgrimages and the way that he spread the word of Buddha, starting in the city over here and moving into the forest and coming back into contact with other people. All around this, you see those symbols again, the three lions here, now needing to be represented in this relief form so that they don't look like they're back to back so much. And above them, that wheel of the law of Dharma that is getting unfolded here. Accompanying these temples are all of these, incredibly eroticized female forms of the yaksha. A yaksha female, basically, personification of nature and its procreative forces, hang off of, in this case, a little edge of the Tirana to hold it up, but also to emphasize the idea, going back to earlier earth religions, of the fertility and fecundity of the universe. If you're to associate this with the earlier form, notice how there are various variations between this. As your text points out, the one on the left, which we just covered, the female figure with the fly whisk, actually seems to be deeply indebted when it comes to its style to early Hellenistic forms, meaning late Greek forms and Roman forms, with its strict frontality. It's really kind of formal representation of the female figure. Whereas if you look at the female figure that's on the great stupa over here at Sanchi, you see a figure that's really much more dynamic, that's a heck of a lot more kind of organic in its form, in the way that it bends off to one side, that emphasizes not just the breasts here, but also the vulva of the female form in order to really be associated with fertility. She actually hangs off a tree that's full of a bunch of ripe fruits to emphasize that idea of fertility as well. They're just basically two different styles of the same type of representation. If you think about this as accompanied with, all over the Great Stupa, these yaksha forms, which I don't think your text points to, these kind of little fat, male figures who represent the male principle of nature. They're usually benevolent beings that are there to help you out, and they represent, if you're looking for an easy term for it, male virility versus female fertility. And they're complements to one another. And it's not surprising that the Yakshi forms and Yaksha forms, which are probably, they're deeply indebted to earlier indigenous art forms, going all the way back to religions that predate Buddhism, will then be adopted by Buddhism so as to show the Buddha. If you've ever seen that kind of laughing, chubby Buddha around, they are deeply indebted to the male forms, the yaksha forms that you see here. Final thing to say about the stupa, just going to back up a little bit here, is that of course the site for this is really important. It's believed that Buddha's ashes are actually interred here, but the area of Sanchi is the place that Buddha, again the original Buddha here, Shakyamuni Buddha, gave his first sermon. And then, of course, Buddha. There's many different kind of stylistic representations of Buddha, as there are Buddha sculptures, and they're all deeply associated with one time period or another. And frankly, we're not going to go into that in this lecture itself. But what you're looking at here is what's called the standing Buddha of Gantara from the third, probably late second, early third century CE of the Common Era, that would have been set up in a temple or in a palace. And it's just a representation of the Buddha. It's a very formal style, just like the earliest of the female Yakshi figures. It's based upon precedents that come out of late Greek Hellenistic style and Roman style, and mixed together with the indigenous style of the West. And we see that, for instance, in the planar kind of representation of the face that looks suspiciously like, like an Egyptian sculpture or something like that. The hairstyle of the Buddha, by the way, with its top knot up here, represents his enlightenment. The folding of the drapery is usually a thing that's a dead giveaway for the styles of the Buddha. It's meant to be linear in pattern and be decorative, but in this case, it shows you a little indication of a knee down here below, as if he's on the move or as if he's relaxed, I think is what your text says about this figure. All Buddhas tend to hold their hands up in symbols. These are called mudra. This one has been lost, but we're pretty sure that this mudra would have been the abhayaya mudra, which means have no fear, like you have a place of comfort here. A less formalized style of the Buddha is represented here. This is the Buddha teaching his first sermon from Sarnath again. And Sarnath, again, place of his first teaching from the middle of the 5th century CE. You can probably tell this. He looks a little bit like those yaksha figures. He's a bit more fleshy. There's a little less stylization to his body. You can see right through his cloth here. He's seated in what's called the yoga pose or the lotus pose here over a stylized lotus blossom at the bottom. Once again, you see the lions down at the bottom. Let's say this was not a relief sculpture, but a freestanding sculpture. They would be on all 4 sides to be associated with the Chakravartin idea of extending Buddhism throughout the world. He has a couple of attendants next to him on each side. They're not bodhisattva figures yet, but later on they will be. And then at the top, a couple of celestial beings. The circle that's around his head refers to his enlightenment, but also to the wheel of Dharma. And then, because he taught his first sermon underneath a tree, a very particular tree that I'm not making you remember here, you see that tree and these stylized leaves up above him. In this case, once again, the mudra, or the hand gesture, which actually has a wheel on it, that wheel of Dharma on it to show you, and it's on his feet as well. I'm sorry, I just pointed at the screen, but here it is. You can probably barely see it. The wheel of the law of Dharma here on his feet and on his hands, symbolizing his enlightenment. This is about you have no fear, like you have a safe place here. I'll teach you the right things. Most of these Buddha type figures remain roughly the same. And if you were to take a class on Asian art, you would learn more about why each one has slightly different body types and how that is a part of a particular stylistic period. I find that far less important than the basic ideas behind these representations. These are not so dissimilar than what you saw when you're looking at Byzantine icons. These are meant to be exemplars for your own spiritual meditative practices under Buddha. They're meant to be models for, a figure who did devote himself to his practice, tried to follow the Eightfold Path and succeeded and attained enlightenment, something that will help all followers of Buddhism. The symbols are almost always the same in these things. He's seated in a lotus pose. Behind him is a big circle representing both the universe and his enlightenment, and also a kind of allusion to the wheel of Dharma or the wheel of the law, with celestial beings on both sides, meaning you will attain enlightenment as well. The top of his hair is that top knot, again representing enlightenment. If you were to spend more time on this, you'd realize that at certain periods of time, particularly when Buddhism is adopted by the state, and they want to emphasize the idea that at one point Buddha was a prince. They will show him with elongated earlobes. That's a reference to the idea that princes oftentimes wore very heavy earrings that stretched their ears out, showing that he was once a prince, and his fancy hairdo as well is a symbol of the upper classes, so as to associate again him with coming from the priestly class. Down below are his followers, people who are learning from his teaching. And then in this case, the mudra or hand signal that he gives you is the symbol of abhaya, which means teaching. The abhaya mudra, which looks kind of like he's counting things off of his fingers, is symbolic of his teaching and the various rules of Buddhism. Now, well, let's see. Yeah. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I gave the wrong name for this mudra. The mudra itself is called the Dharma Chakra mudra. The Dharma Chakra mudra is teaching, ticking those fingers off. And then I just wanted to end us up with this very, very kind of ubiquitous figure of, because I love him. That's the only reason he's included in here. I'm not going to talk at any length about Hinduism, which is a syncretic religion that draws together some of the most ancient ideas from this part of the world with elements of Buddhism and frankly many other religions, and takes many different forms. Hinduism does. But I wanted to show you this major character under Hinduism. This is Shiva. In particular, Shiva's manifestation as Shiva Nataraja, or Lord of the Dance. And it's from around the 11th century CE from India. It's a cire perdu, or lost wax casting. There are hundreds of thousands of these in the world. They're set up both in temples as well as in homes. And they're, again, contemplative, meant to kind of remind us of the nature of the universe here. Shiva Nataraja is a symbol of the becoming and the destruction of the universe. Shiva is one of those gods who is a manifestation of Brahma, the main kind of key god who dreams into existence the entire universe. And in this manifestation, Shiva represents kind of the cycles of nature. We're kind of returning back to our earliest forms here, which is one of the reasons that I brought this in as the last image that I would show you. If you remember back to the early cave paintings, if you remember those early fertility goddesses, if you think a little bit about even Stonehenge, so many of them had to do with, on the one hand, understanding, and on the other hand, trying to control the way that nature unfolds to gain some kind of again, some insight and mechanism of control over the fact that nature undergoes these processes or cycles of birth and death and destruction and then, rebirth or construction. Shiva Nataraja represents all of that as Lord of the Dance here. The symbolism is very standard in here. Shiva is almost always shown with his four arms, kind of mutual manifestations of multiple different aspects of Shiva. Circling him is this round form representing the universe, on which there are these little stylized flames everywhere. The flames both represent, on the one hand, the idea of building, and on the other hand, destruction, the idea of a nascent kind of idea, or for instance, cooking food or what have you, but also the idea that everything that is born will also die. The flames also represent for Shiva, and you see one in his hand, two very specific things. The flame represents the destruction of samsara. Samsara means kind of like the physical universe, your material being, which needs to be destroyed in a sense to allow for spiritual awakening. But it also represents, and these are very closely tied to each other, Maya. And Maya represents illusion, or the illusion of the physical encounter with the universe, under which there is some kind of more enduring, eternal set of spiritual ideas. Also in his hand, you see a drum. The drum over here is a symbol of the life beat. of the rhythms of nature. They go through these cycles of birth, death, rebirth, and so forth. One hand in front of him represents the promise of liberation. That's the mudra for the promise of liberation. And the other hand that's held up like this in front of you is the Abhaya mudra, which is a symbol of protection, or a symbol that you'll be okay under the religion of Hinduism and under the protection of 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 this god of Shiva. The final thing that you see in this representation, it's not in every single one, but at the bottom, this dwarf figure is named Apasmara. Apasmara is a symbol of becoming. It's almost like a child form becoming an adult. But according to Hinduism and many world religions, being born into the world and growing to adulthood is one form of becoming. The other form of becoming is a spiritual awakening, that it can occur throughout your entire life to become more knowledgeable about, in this case, the state of the universe, which is what Shiva Nataraja represents. One more of these, just wanted to show you. There are a ton of these, and they keep the same kind of symbolism all the way through. Shiva Nataraja as Lord of the Dance. Well, I hope you've had fun this quarter. I certainly have had fun talking about these ancient forms of art all the way through the mid-century. If you're interested, next quarter I will pick up where we left off this time, looking at kind of early medieval art and spending a lot of time on the Renaissance and Baroque period, and moving forward right up until the French Revolution. Talk to you later. Bye.